Before we go any further into this story, if what you just heard made your heart skip even a single beat, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about real courage, about how the system doesn't always win, about how one woman's refusal to stay down changed everything, and subscribe to Acts of Depth. Because we tell the stories that matter, the ones that don't make the headlines but should, the ones that restore your faith in what's possible when people refuse to accept injustice. Now let's go back. Let's go back to where this all started, because you need to understand who she was before that courtroom, before that slap, before the world knew her name. Her name was Amara Collins, and 6 months before that day in court, she was standing in a different kind of room entirely. The kitchen of a two-bedroom apartment in South Memphis, where the refrigerator hummed too loud and the linoleum had started peeling near the stove. She was washing dishes by hand because the dishwasher had broken in March and it was now September, and some repairs you just learned to live without. Through the window above the sink, she could see the playground across the street, could hear children laughing in that high-pitched way that sounds like freedom. And she thought about her daughter Destiny was 7 years old and had started asking questions Amara didn't know how to answer. Questions like why they had to move 3 times in 2 years, why Mama couldn't come to the school's career day like the other parents, why the landlord kept calling and making Mama's voice go small and tight. Amara scrubbed a plate harder than necessary, watched the soap suds swirl down the drain, and made a decision that would put everything in motion. She was going to law school. Not someday, not when things got better. Now. People had laughed when she said it out loud for the first time. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but that nervous kind that's wrapped in concern, the kind that says, be realistic without using those words. She was 32 years old with a GED she'd earned at 19, working double shifts at a call center where she fielded complaints from people who had never missed a rent payment in their lives. She had $1,700 in savings and a credit score that made loan officers wince. But she also had something else, something she'd carried since she was Destiny's age. Since the day she'd watched her own mother stand in front of a judge who had looked right through her like she was made of glass. That judge had taken 4 minutes to decide her mother wasn't fit, another 2 to terminate her parental rights, and Amara had spent the next 11 years in foster care understanding that the law was a weapon, and the people who wielded it rarely looked like her. So she was going to learn to hold that weapon herself. She was going to become what she'd needed when she was 7 years old and powerless. The LSAT prep books came from the library, their spines already cracked from other dreamers who checked them out and probably given up. Amara studied them on her lunch breaks, on the bus, at 3 in the morning when Destiny was asleep and the apartment was finally quiet enough to think. She memorized logical reasoning patterns while her daughter watched cartoons. She practiced analytical writing while stirring pasta on the stove. 4 months later, she took the test in a high school classroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety. And when the scores came back, she'd hit exactly the number she needed. Not stellar, not scholarship material, but enough. Enough to get into Memphis State's night program if she could prove she was serious, if she could show them she was more than her circumstances. The admissions essay took her 3 weeks to write. She threw away 14 drafts before she found the words that felt true. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about sitting in that courtroom at 7 years old and realizing that justice was supposed to be blind, but somehow it always seemed to see color just fine. They accepted her on a conditional basis, probationary status. 1 semester to prove she could handle the coursework while working full-time, while being a single mother, while living a life that didn't pause just because she'd decided to chase something impossible. Orientation was on a Tuesday evening in September, in a lecture hall with stadium seating and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unwell. Amara sat in the back row and looked around at her classmates. Most of them were younger, fresh from undergrad, with their parents' encouragement still ringing in their ears. They had laptops that weren't held together with electrical tape. They had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told you don't belong somewhere. The professor teaching the introduction to constitutional law walked in precisely at 6, and Amara opened her notebook, the cheap kind from the dollar store, and started writing. That night, she filled 23 pages. She got home at 11. Destiny was asleep on the couch where the babysitter had left her, still in her school clothes. Amara carried her daughter to bed, kissed her forehead, and allowed herself to feel it. Hope, just for a moment, just enough to be dangerous. The trouble started small, the way trouble always does. An assignment she turned in on time but formatted wrong. A question she asked in class that revealed she didn't understand a foundational concept everyone else seemed to know. The professor, a white man in his 60s named Dr. Hennigan, had a way of smiling when he corrected her that made her skin crawl. That smile that said, "I'm being patient with you," while his eyes said something else entirely. But Amara pushed through. She studied harder. She asked fewer questions in class and more in office hours where there weren't witnesses to her ignorance. Her grades were decent, not top of the class, but solid, passing, proving she belonged. Then came the accusation, and everything she'd built started crumbling before she could even understand what was happening. It was Professor Hennigan who made the claim. He said she'd plagiarized her midterm essay on due process and equal protection, said the writing was too sophisticated, too polished to be hers, especially given her performance on the in-class assignments. He'd filed a formal complaint with the Academic Integrity Board, and there would be a hearing. Amar read the notice 3 times before the words made sense. Plagiarism, academic dishonesty, possible expulsion. She thought about the essay in question, the one she'd worked on for 2 weeks, the one where she'd quoted Thurgood Marshall and cited 14 different cases and poured every ounce of herself into the argument that the law had failed people like her mother, like her, like Destiny, but that it didn't have to. She'd written it at midnight and during lunch breaks and in the laundromat while waiting for the dryer to stop. Every word was hers. Every sentence had been built from the ground up with her own sweat and sleep deprivation and desperate hope. And now she was being told it was too good to be real, which really meant she was too poor, too black, too unpolished to have produced it. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. She needed to prepare a defense. She needed evidence that the work was her own, but more than that, she needed to not break. Not in front of Destiny, not in front of the people who were already whispering in the hallways that she'd never belonged. That was the thing that saved her, at least partially. For years, since she was 19 and had started trying to build a life out of nothing, Amara had written things down, thoughts, arguments, ideas she wanted to remember. When she'd started the law school essay, she'd sketched out the concepts in that journal first, rough and raw and unformed. She had the drafts on her laptop too, the version history showing how the essay had evolved over 2 weeks from a scattered mess into something coherent. She printed everything. She gathered her evidence like she was building a case because that's exactly what she was doing. The night before the hearing, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with all the pages spread out in front of her, a timeline of her own thoughts, and she practiced what she would say, how she would defend herself, how she would prove that her voice was worth hearing even when it surprised people by being more than they expected. Destiny came out of the bedroom at 2 a.m, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, why are you still awake?" Amara pulled her daughter into her lap, held her close enough to feel her heartbeat. "I'm fighting, baby. Sometimes grown-ups have to fight for things that should already be ours." The hearing took place in an administrative office that tried to look official, but mostly just looked tired. There were 5 people on the panel, 3 professors, 1 student representative, and an associate dean who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. Professor Hennigan sat to the side, his hands folded, his expression appropriately concerned, but with something underneath it, something that looked like satisfaction. Amara presented her evidence methodically. She showed the journal entries, the draft history. She even pulled up the essay on her laptop and walked them through her research process, showing the tabs she'd kept open, the notes she'd made in the margins of library books. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Professor Hennigan spoke. He acknowledged the drafts were compelling, he said, but that didn't prove anything. She could have hired someone to write it and then created false evidence after the fact. He'd seen it before, he said. Students who got desperate and made bad choices. He said it kindly, like he was trying to help her, like he was giving her an out. If you just admit what happened, we can discuss remediation rather than expulsion. The thing about being underestimated your whole life is that you develop radar for it. You can smell condescension from 3 rooms away. You know the difference between someone who doubts you because they don't have enough information and someone who doubts you because they've already decided what you're capable of based on what you look like, where you come from, how you sound when you speak. Amara looked at Professor Hennigan, really looked at him, and she understood that this wasn't about the essay. This was about a man who'd built a career on being the authority, on deciding who belonged in the sacred halls of legal education, and she had disrupted his sense of order just by existing in his classroom and doing well. She turned to the panel. Her voice was steady when she spoke. I wrote every word of that essay. I can defend every argument in it right now without notes because it came from my lived experience and my research and my belief that the law should serve everyone, not just people who look like you. The last three words landed like stones in still water. The student representative shifted in her seat. One of the professors cleared his throat, but Amara wasn't done. If my writing is too sophisticated to be believable, maybe you should ask yourself why you find it so hard to believe that someone like me can think deeply about justice. The panel deliberated for 30 minutes while Amara sat in the hallway on a plastic chair that was slightly too small, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles went pale. When they called her back in, the associate dean delivered the verdict. They found the evidence of plagiarism to be inconclusive, but given Professor Hennigan's concerns and her probationary status, they were recommending she retake the class next semester with a different instructor and that the disputed essay receive a grade of incomplete pending further review. It was a compromise, a political solution that let everyone save face. Amara felt it like a punch to the sternum, not expelled but not exonerated either. Still under suspicion, still marked. She said thank you because that's what you're supposed to say, even when you're being handed injustice wrapped in bureaucratic language. She walked out of that building into November air that tasted like early winter, and she made it to her car before the tears came. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, crying the kind of tears that come from rage as much as sorrow, and then she dried her face and went to pick up Destiny from after-school care because life doesn't stop for heartbreak. She should have let it go. That's what her cousin told her. What the few friends she'd made in law school whispered in sympathetic voices. Take the incomplete, retake the class, keep your head down, graduate, and get out. But there was something in Amara that couldn't swallow it, couldn't accept being branded as suspicious when she'd done everything right. She started asking questions, quiet ones at first. She learned that Professor Hennigan had filed 3 other plagiarism complaints in the past 6 years. All 3 students had been Black or Latino. 2 had dropped out. 1 had graduated, but only after a lengthy appeal process. She learned that none of those cases had resulted in proven plagiarism either. Just settlements and compromises that left everyone tainted. She collected testimonies from other students who'd experienced his classroom differently, depending on their last names and their skin tones. She built another case, this one not about her innocence, but about a pattern of discrimination that the school had been quietly enabling for years. And then she filed a formal complaint against Professor Hennigan and the law school with the Tennessee Human Rights Commission. That's what led to the courtroom. Not the student hearing, but an actual legal proceeding, because the law school had fought her complaint and the commission had investigated and found enough evidence of discriminatory practices to recommend mediation. And when the school refused, it had escalated to a formal hearing in civil court. Amara couldn't afford a lawyer, so she represented herself. She'd learned enough in her 1 semester to be dangerous, or at least to try. The school showed up with a team of 3 attorneys from a firm that billed $500 an hour. It was David and Goliath, except David didn't have a sling, and Goliath had unlimited resources and a vested interest in making sure this uppity woman who dared to challenge the system got crushed thoroughly enough that no one else would try. The hearing was set for a Friday morning in late February, in a courtroom that still had radiators hissing in the corners and windows that looked out on a gray sky threatening snow. The judge was a man named Walter Brennan, 68 years old, appointed to the bench before Amara was born, with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and not suffering fools. She'd prepared everything she could. Her evidence was organized in a binder with color-coded tabs. Her opening statement was memorized. She'd practiced her arguments in the bathroom mirror and in front of Destiny, who'd clapped when Mama used her serious voice. But when Amara walked into that courtroom, wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a blazer from Goodwill and pants that were a size too big, cinched with a belt, she felt the weight of it. The opposing counsel in their tailored suits, the court reporter looking bored already, the bailiff, a white man in his 50s with a face like a clenched fist, and Judge Brennan on his bench, looking down at the docket like the people in his courtroom were items on a grocery list to be checked off and forgotten. The proceedings started promptly at 9. The school's lawyers went first, framing Amara's complaint as frivolous. A disgruntled student upset about academic consequences, lashing out with unfounded accusations. They were smooth, professional. They made it sound reasonable that a professor might be extra vigilant about plagiarism, that standards were standards, that this was about protecting the integrity of legal education, not about race. When it was Amara's turn to speak, she stood and began presenting her case. She made it 3 minutes before Judge Brennan interrupted her. "Ms. Collins, do you have any legal training?" His voice was sharp, impatient. Amara paused. "Your Honor, I completed 1 semester of law school before." "1 semester, so you're representing yourself with 1 semester of legal education and a grievance." He said the word like it tasted bad. "Your Honor, I have evidence of a discriminatory pattern. What you have is a binder of speculation and a failed academic record." The words hit like a slap, but Amara kept her composure. "Your Honor, if you'd allow me to present my evidence, I can show—" "I've reviewed your filing, Ms. Collins. It's thin. You're asking this court to believe that a tenured professor at a respected institution systematically targeted minority students based on nothing but your interpretation of events. It's not just my interpretation I have testimony from. Hearsay and conjecture." Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly, and there was something in his eyes that Amara recognized. The same thing she'd seen in Professor Hennigan. The same thing she'd seen in that judge when she was 7 years old watching her mother lose everything. The assumption that she didn't matter, that her voice was noise, that justice was for other people. She tried to continue. She spoke faster, trying to get her arguments out before he could cut her off again. She referenced case law, cited precedents about disparate treatment and educational discrimination. The school's attorneys objected 3 times in 2 minutes. Judge Brennan sustained every objection. Amara felt the ground shifting under her, felt the case slipping away before she'd even had a chance to make it. She reached into her binder for the testimony from other students, pulled out the page, and stepped forward toward the bench. "Your Honor, if you'll just look at—" That's when the bailiff moved. She hadn't seen him coming. He grabbed her arm, the one holding the papers, and yanked her back. "Step away from the bench." His voice was loud, aggressive. Amara stumbled but kept hold of the documents. "I'm just trying to submit evidence. I said step back." He grabbed her other arm now, twisting it behind her back. The papers scattered across the floor. Amara tried to pull away, instinct more than strategy, and that's when it happened. The bailiff's hand came up fast and connected with her face. An open palm that cracked across her cheek and jaw with enough force that she went down, her knees hitting the marble, then her shoulder, then her cheek pressed against the cold floor. The courtroom froze. Someone gasped. Amara lay there, tasting copper, feeling the sting spread across her face like fire. She could hear her own breathing, loud in her ears, could see the scattered pages of her evidence. All that work, all that hope, spread out like trash across the courtroom floor. And in that moment, something crystallized. This was what the system did. It didn't just deny you justice. It humiliated you for asking. It punished you for believing you deserved better. She'd been slapped down her whole life, metaphorically and now literally, and she'd kept getting up, kept trying, kept believing that if she just worked hard enough, was smart enough, proved herself thoroughly enough, the doors would open. But the doors were locked from the inside, and the people holding the keys had no intention of letting her through. She could stay down, accept the message, go home to destiny and figure out a different path, a smaller dream. Or she could get up one more time. Amara pushed herself up slowly, her hands flat against the marble, then her knees straightened, then she was standing. Blood from where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek was warm in her mouth. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, that deliberate swipe, and she looked at Judge Brennan. He'd gone pale. The bailiff had backed up, his hand still raised slightly, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. The school's attorneys were whispering urgently to each other. And in the gallery, in the back row where Amara hadn't noticed anyone sitting, a woman in a gray suit stood up. She was black, maybe 50, with silver streaking her hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent a lifetime refusing to bend. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority. "Your Honor, my name is Judge Patricia Winters. I'm here from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, sitting in observation as part of the Judicial Review Committee. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and I need to stop these proceedings immediately." Judge Brennan's face went from pale to red. "Judge Winters, this is highly irregular. What's irregular is watching a pro se litigant get assaulted in your courtroom for attempting to submit evidence." Judge Winters walked past Amara, past the bailiff, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor, and stood directly in front of the bench. "What's irregular is the way you've conducted this hearing from the moment it started, interrupting the complainant, sustaining objections before arguments were fully made, and showing clear bias against a woman trying to defend herself against credible allegations of discrimination." She turned to look at the bailiff. "And what's irregular is that officer using physical force against someone who posed no threat and was in no way out of order." Judge Winters pulled a phone from her pocket and made a call that lasted 15 seconds. Then she turned back to Judge Brennan. "There are 2 more appellate benches in the building next door. They'll be here in 5 minutes. We're convening an emergency review panel, and you're recusing yourself from this case effective immediately." The next 20 minutes felt like watching reality rearrange itself. Judge Brennan tried to argue, but Judge Winters cut through his objections like they were made of tissue paper. 2 more judges arrived, one black man in his 60s, one white woman in her 40s, both carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. They took statements from everyone present. They reviewed the case file. They watched the courtroom video footage that had captured everything, including the slap the bailiff was removed from the courtroom by 2 police officers who looked deeply uncomfortable about arresting one of their own. The school's attorneys tried to salvage the situation by offering to settle, but Judge Winters shut that down too. "This isn't about settlement. This is about whether justice was even possible in this courtroom today, and the answer appears to be no." She turned to Amara, who'd been standing in a kind of shocked stillness, watching her entire narrative shift. "Ms. Collins, these proceedings are being declared a mistrial due to judicial misconduct and courtroom irregularities. Your case will be reheard in front of an impartial judge, and you'll be provided with pro bono legal representation from the Tennessee Access to Justice Commission." Judge Winters stepped closer, her voice dropping so only Amara could hear. "You were right to bring this case. Don't let them convince you otherwise." The appellate panel wasn't done. They asked Amara if she was willing to stay for another hour, and when she said yes, they did something she'd never seen before. They convened an immediate preliminary hearing on her discrimination complaint, right there, with Judge Winters presiding. They allowed her to present her evidence, all of it, without interruption. They questioned the school's attorneys about the pattern of plagiarism accusations against minority students. They demanded documentation of Professor Hennigan's complaint history, and when one of the school's lawyers tried to dismiss Amara's testimony as unreliable because she was an interested party, Judge Winters stopped him cold. "Counselor, this woman has shown more dedication to the pursuit of justice in 1 semester than many lawyers demonstrate in entire careers. Her testimony is not only reliable, it's the foundation of this case. Proceed with respect or don't proceed at all." By the time it was over, the panel had issued a preliminary finding that Amara's complaint had substantial merit and ordered the law school to suspend Professor Hennigan pending a full investigation. They also ordered her immediate reinstatement as a student in good standing with the incomplete grade removed from her record. But Judge Winters did something else too, something that nobody in that courtroom expected. She asked Amara to approach the bench. When Amara stepped forward, still shaky, still processing everything that had happened in the past 90 minutes, Judge Winters gestured to the chair she was sitting in, the judge's seat. "Sit down for a moment." Amara hesitated. "Your Honor, I don't..." "Sit. It wasn't a request. Amara sat in the judge's chair, the leather still warm, the courtroom spreading out before her from this new angle. Everything looked different from up here, smaller somehow, but also clearer. Judge Winters stood beside her and spoke quietly but firmly. I want you to remember what this feels like, not the power, because that's not what this seat is about, despite what some people think, but the responsibility, the ability to decide whether someone gets heard or gets dismissed, whether justice happens or gets delayed, whether a person leaves this room with hope or with nothing. She paused. You belong here, Ms. Collins. Maybe not in this exact chair, not yet, but in this system, fighting for the people who need someone to fight. Don't forget that. And don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Amara sat in that judge's seat for maybe 30 seconds, but those seconds rewrote something fundamental inside her. She thought about her mother, about 7-year-old Amara watching powerlessly as a judge decided her fate. She thought about all the people who told her to be realistic, to know her place, to understand that some doors weren't meant for people like her. And she thought about Destiny, who was in 2nd grade learning about what she could become, who needed to see that the world could be different than it had always been. When Amara stood up from that chair, something had shifted. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been slapped down, literally or metaphorically, for daring to demand what they'd been promised: equal protection under the law, due process, justice. She thanked Judge Winters, gathered her scattered papers from where they'd fallen, and walked out of that courtroom with her head up. The case against the law school would continue. Professor Hennigan would eventually be forced into early retirement after the investigation revealed a decade of discriminatory conduct, and Amara would finish law school, this time with a full scholarship funded by the Judicial Oversight Committee that had investigated Judge Brennan's conduct and found a pattern of bias in his courtroom too.